W- William Dalrymple, for those of you who may not be aware of this, Willie, made all of this happen. He was one of the founders of the Jaipur Literary Festival. He's been my friend now since 1997, and an enemy before that. Willie is a best-selling author of many wonderful books, including most recently Return of a King, An Indian Army in Afghanistan. He's won the Sunday Times Young British Writer of the Year Award, the Wilson Prize for History, and the Scottish Book of the Year Award, and has, prior to the shortlisting of Return of a King, been long-listed 3 times for the Samuel Johnson Prize. The Italian edition of Return of a King won the 2015 Hemingway Prize and the prestigious Kapuscinski Prize for Literary Reportage. The great thing about Willie's books is his intense engagement with Indian history. Now, Henry Ford famously said, "History is bunk." That's because Henry Ford did not read William Dalrymple. He's got this great way of digging deep into the archives and going deeper than anyone has, including professional historians who have tenured positions in universities to do this. But he finds this archival material and makes a story out of it, which is incredibly compelling and always, in some strange twist of history, very, very contemporary, and somehow reflects on the times that we live in, like the Afghanistan books. He's now, I'm very pleased to report, has written a book about the Kohinoor Diamond. And the Kohinoor Diamond, of course, was Indian until it was stolen by his people. So it's only fitting that he's written a book about it, and particularly for me, because I come from 3 generations of diamond merchants. So, Willie, take it away and give it back.
I'm not quite sure who I'm filling in for here, but someone told me yesterday that I had an extra slot. So you're going to be subjected to an hour of Kohinoor, which is a book which isn't yet written, as you will see, no doubt, from the hesitancy of what follows. But you're very kind to be a guinea pig audience for me to try out my new research on. The Kohinoor Diamond is the most famous diamond in the world. It's also the ultimate symbol of colonial loot. It is, along with the Elgin marbles, probably the 2 most controversial objects purloined by the British. And as recently as last April, there was an application from the Indian government, as Suketu so delicately alluded to give it back. However, the story is a little bit more complicated than many people realize. And as well as applications from the Indian government, there have been similar applications from the Persians, the Iranians, the Pakistanis, the Afghans, and most recently the Taliban, all of whom believe this diamond should not be in the Tower of London. And as I will hope in the next hour to show, there are good reasons why any of these could actually put in quite a decent claim to this most seductive and sought after of the world's gems. If we could have the next slide. No, that's not it. I'm doing brilliant. Here we go. So on the 29th of March, 1849, the 10-year-old Maharaja of the Punjab, Dalrymple Singh, was ushered into the magnificent mirrored hall at the center of the fort of Lahore. There, in a public ceremony, the frightened but dignified child, shown here in a white jama from the Illustrated London News, yielded to months of pressure and signed a formal act of submission. This document, later known as the Treaty of Lahore, handed over to the British East India Company swathes of the richest land in India, the Punjab, and specifically to Queen Victoria, not to the East India Company who took over the land, to Queen Victoria, handed over the most valuable object in not just the Punjab, but the entire subcontinent, the celebrated Kohinoor Diamond, or Mountain of Light. Article 3 of this treaty read simply, "The gem called the Kohinoor, which was taken from Shah Shuja-ul-Mulk by Maharaja Ranjin Singh, shall be surrendered by the Maharaja of Lahore to the Queen of England." Now, this was, in fact, rather a bit of an electioneering. Dalhousie, who was coming to the end of his period as Governor General, decided that he wanted to get the Queen's favour, and with an eye to future postings like Foreign Secretary and possibly Prime Minister. An ambitious young man still at the height of his career with many years still left to go. And personally made the decision that this diamond should not go, like the land that he had just conquered, to a public corporation, the East India Company, but to the Queen. Now, we all talk about the British conquering India, but this is an inaccuracy. Something much worse happened. India in the late 18th and early 19th century was conquered by a multinational corporation. The shareholders of that corporation were, in many cases, Indian. They were also French, Dutch, Portuguese, Spanish, and Russian. And the East India Company was the first great multinational. When the American Revolution broke out and tea was dumped in Boston Harbor, that was East India Company tea, offloaded from East India Company clippers who had picked it up from Hong Kong and from Shanghai in exchange for Indian opium, which they had grown in the opium fields of Bihar. So starting a very profitable triangular trade between China, India, and Britain. But in the course of pursuing this trade, towards the end of the 18th century, the East India Company bought itself an army 4 times the size of the British army. When they went bankrupt briefly in 1774, they unlike Lehman Brothers, were bailed out by the British government because they genuinely were too big to fail. They accounted for half of British imports and exports. And so this vast, unwieldy corporation, whose shareholders numbered at least 2/3 of the MPs in Parliament, and whose grip on the legislature was such that the National Rifle League, or APAC, would envy greatly. They had a complete hold on British politics for 100 years. And there is no modern equivalent. Imagine, I don't know, Halliburton with nuclear jets, or Google with a fleet of nuclear submarines, or Facebook with infantry regiments. Because this was a multinational corporation spanning the globe, which could buy any legislature, which could conquer any resisting army, and in its heyday was probably the most single powerful private institution in the world. Now, when Dalhousie got his hands on the Kohinoor, he immediately commissioned a history of this diamond. And he went to a young man in Delhi called Theo Metcalfe, who was interested in gems. And Theo's job was to go around all the jewelers and princes of Delhi, collecting the lore about this great diamond. And the report which he produced, which is still in the Indian National Archives, is the basis for the history of the Kohinoor that's been repeated in numerous articles, essays, books, right up to the current Wikipedia entry online at this moment. And yet, almost everything about it is, in my opinion, unproven, unsubstantiated, and open to inquiry. Because when Theo collected this material, the diamond had already left Delhi a century earlier. Theo was collecting folklore from jewelers and princes in 1849. The diamond left Delhi in the hands of the Persian conqueror Nadir Shah in 1739, 120 years earlier. And so almost everything he said was hearsay. And anyone that tries actually to substantiate the history of this gem runs very soon aground. And I've spent the best part of this year trying to look at Mughal, Sultanate, and Persian sources for this diamond. And the earliest 100% certain reference to this gem does not predate, as far as I can see, 1751, when one of Nadir Shah's chroniclers mentions that this gem is attached to the peacock throne of Shah Jahan. And intriguingly, while we have about 12 detailed eyewitness accounts of this momentous occasion when the Persian warlord Nadir Shah descends the Khyber Pass, conquers Afghanistan, takes Delhi, and empties Delhi of 8 generations of Mughal loot. The Mughals have been cleaning up around South Asia for 6 generations. And Nadir Shah takes the whole lot back to Persia with him. But only one source, a Persian chronicler called Marvi Yazdi, only one specifically mentions the Kohinoor. And if you look at all the stories associated with the Kohinoor, almost all of them go back to this report written by Theo Metcalfe following the handing over the diamond in 1849. But almost none of these stories seem to have any substantiated ground in historical fact. For example, there is a story that Theo tells that when Nadir Shah conquered Delhi, the Mughal Emperor Muhammad Shah Rangila hides the diamond in his turban. And Nadir Shah is sleeping with one of the great courtesans of Delhi, and she happens to know where Muhammad Shah has hidden it, tells Nadir Shah. So when he's about to leave, Nadir Shah says, "My brother, as the last sign of our friendship between our two dynasties, let us swap our turbans." And so the swap takes place, and the Kohinoor ends up in Nadir Shah. Lovely story. Absolutely no basis in any contemporary source whatsoever that I have found, or indeed any previous research. And yet this story it's such a nice story, it gets recycled over and over again. And the reality is, we don't know what the history of this diamond is before it's taken by the Persians, which is remarkable because the Mughals were obsessed with gems. Can I have the next slide, please? Here is Shah Jahan holding, characteristically shown, holding a wonderful diamond from his collection. The Mughals, as much as any dynasty, were write over and over ago about gemstones and jewelry and diamonds. They build the peacock throne, which is this incredible piece of furniture that costs 4 times the Taj Mahal to build, dripping with diamonds and gemstones. But there is no certain mention of the Kohinoor in any of these sources. And we simply do not know the origins of this stone. The first reference to it being called the Kohinoor is in 1751, when it's recorded as being the head of the peacock on top of the peacock throne. And this is a 100% unambiguous, clear reference. But before that, while there are many mentions of great gems, none of them can be said for certain to be the Kohinoor. And the reason, in my view, that the Kohinoor has been given this elaborate prehistory that you'll read about elsewhere is what happens immediately after it's handed over to the British. It goes from 1849 being handed over to Lord Dalhousie, and in 1851 it's not put in the Tower of London or given to Queen Victoria straight away. Instead, it's put into the Great Exhibition in London of 1851. And the Great Exhibition is the most public exhibition of the British Empire ever to be mounted. The Brits throw money at it. They build the Crystal Palace. There are queues miles long, the world's media coverage, and it's like a Roman triumph. It's the British at the peak of their power showing off all the objects that they've bought, looted, conquered, gathered, put together from across their conquests. And from this point, the Kohinoor appears on the front page of the Times, it appears in the Illustrated London News, all the press about it. Within a few years of that, you're getting books like The Moonstone being written by Wilkie Collins, Lothair, which is a story of Indian diamonds, written by the Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli. All these begin to enter into popular history. And what everyone forgets is that there are other diamonds in the Mughal collections which are the same or of greater weight and size than the Kohinoor. Particularly the great Mughal diamond, known probably today as the Orlov diamond in the scepter of the Kremlin, and the Daryanur, the Sea of Light, which is in the Persian royal treasures in Tehran. Now, there are at least these other two diamonds which are the same or greater size than the Kohinoor. But because they disappeared off to Persia and Russia, they never entered Western mythology and popular history, and so were forgotten about. So any mention in Mughal sources of a great diamond being turned up and given becomes retrospectively attributed to the Kohinoor. So we find a retrospective history of the Kohinoor being written, where in fact substantiated history there is none. So I'm going to take you back to the beginning of the story and talk a little bit about diamonds in ancient India. Now, with the exception of a few stones from Borneo, all the diamonds in the ancient world came from southern India. There were the great Golconda diamond workings, not mines, incidentally, because all Indian diamonds are alluvial. That you don't hack away at them like you do at a coal mine. You sieve them like you do for gold. And there are 2 or 3 extinct riverbeds in Andhra Pradesh running out of particular mineral sediments in which tiny octahedral diamond fragments were found with great frequency. And by sieving this stuff, from a very early date, diamonds began to find their way across the world. By 3000 BC, diamonds are being used to polish the stones going into the pyramids. By 100 BC, diamond rings are incredibly auspicious objects in ancient Rome. But they're not diamond rings in the sense that we know them today as these wonderful, brilliant cut things that shine nicely on people's hands in the West today. Instead, they are small octahedral crystals. And very occasionally, they grow larger. And in 1 or 2 occasions, they grow into something about the size of a hen's egg. And the Kohinoor is one of these rare freak crystals, which presumably had its origins in the ancient Golconda riverbeds in southern India. Now, in Hindu mythology, diamonds are incredibly auspicious objects. There's a very elaborate cosmology for them, which reaches its most elaborate version in the Garuda Purnima, written probably in the 10th century AD. And they talk about the demon Bala, who agrees to be sacrificed by the gods and yields up his ghost for the good of the universe. And behold, the severed limbs of his sacrificed body were converted into the seeds of gems. Then the Yakshas and the Siddhas and the Nagas eagerly rushed to collect the seeds of these gems. And there were mighty flutterings of celestial pinions and rustlings of celestial garments in the heavens. The gods came riding in their aerial cars and carried away the seeds of gems for their own use, some of which were dropped down to earth through the violent concussions in the air. Wherever they dropped, whether in oceans, rivers, mountains, or wildernesses, there originated mines of these gems through the celestial potency of these seeds. And then the Garuda Purnima goes on to talk about the properties of these gems. Of these gems and precious stones, some are endued with virtues of expiating all sins, or acting as prophylactic against the effects of poison, snake bites, and disease. The learned hold that these diamonds to be the most effulgent of all precious stones. The least particle of the bone of the conqueror Indra, falling or dropping down from the sky, in a country germinates diamond crystals of various shapes. Gods are supposed to dwell in the particles of the diamond, wherever found, which is possessed of a clear light shade, and anyone that possesses a diamond will gain prosperity, long life, the increase of wives, and progeny in domestic animals, the bringing home of a teeming harvest all attend on the use of a diamond. Serpents, tigers, and thieves fly from the presence of a person wearing such a diamond. Now, this may not be the thing noted by people today of if they wear diamonds. Thieves do not necessarily fly from them. In fact, the opposite may be the case, but the Garuda Purnima has its view. Fatal and dreadful poisons secretly administered prove inoperative against the diamond wearer's system, and all his possessions enjoy a sort of immunity from acts of incendiarism or erosion by water. So in other words, these are incredibly auspicious objects. You will have hundreds of wives, your cows will live forever, thieves will disappear. If you're poisoned, it'll have no effect. All you need to do is get your hand on a good diamond. Now, as with so much of Indian culture, the current state of things has come from the collision of the ancient Indian Sanskritic tradition with the various different traditions brought in by Muslims, Turks, and Persians from the 11th century onwards. And in Persia and in the Middle East, there's a very different cosmology. And in that world, interestingly, it is not diamonds that receive the pride of place in Persian manuscripts, but spinels, which are red stones from Badakhshan, and rubies when they come a little bit later from Burma. And in the Ain-i Akbari, which is the book of statecraft written by the Emperor Akbar's leading courtier, Abul Faisal, when he writes about the Mughal treasury, he talks about 8 layers of the treasury. And at the top layer, the peak layer, is the treasury of spinels and rubies. The diamonds are relegated with emeralds and pearls to the second level in the treasury. And in Persian literature, there's a whole rich seam of poetry and prose about red stones of light. For example, the poet Nizami talks in Khosrow Vasharin, when the spinel of the sun rose out of its mine, night gave its last breath for the love of day. So the Mughals like diamonds, and they collect them certainly, but they give pride of place not to diamonds, but to spinels. So if we have the next slide, when the peacock throne is put together by Shah Jahan, he has collected so many of these incredible stones and gems that in 1640, having built the Taj Mahal, he decides to, rather than just leave these great accumulations of gems sitting in a treasury vault, he decides to put them to use in statecraft by making the single most valuable piece of furniture ever made. And he pulls out all the diamonds, all the rubies, all the emeralds, all the pearls, tons of gold, and he makes what's effectively not a throne in the Western sense, more like a little kiosk, where he sits with the entire state treasury glittering around him. And it costs, as I say, 4 times the cost of the Taj Mahal to build this thing. The jeweled throne, as it was originally known, it's later named the Peacock Throne after the 2 peacocks that you can see on the roof in this slide here. There are 2 little peacocks of precious stones on the very top. But the jeweled throne was modeled on Quranic descriptions of the throne of Solomon. And there is a lot of references within the throne to Quranic references of this throne of Solomon. There are descriptions of cypress trees, and emeralds are turned into cypress trees. There are descriptions of all the different facets that the Emperor Solomon's throne is meant to hold. And this was built by Gilani, the great Persian jeweler, to fit this description. And it's the Mughals are obsessed with kingship, with dynastic propaganda. A lot of their art is dedicated to raising the status of the emperor and the king. And jewels and art are put into this by the creation of the Peacock Throne. Here is Ahmed Shah Lahori's description in the Padshah-nama. In the course of years, many valuable gems had come into the imperial jewel house, each of which might serve as an eardrop for Venus or would girdle the sun. Upon the succession of the emperor, it occurred to his mind that in the opinion of far-seeing men, the acquisition of such rare jewels and the keeping of such wonderful brilliance can only render one service, that of adorning the throne of empire. They therefore ought to be able to put them to use, that beholders might share in and benefit by their splendor, and that His Majesty might shine with increasing brilliancy. So this extraordinary object at the peak of Mughal power is assembled. And even before this, the Mughals have been famous for their love of gems. When the first British ambassador to the Mughal court, Sir Thomas Roe, arrives in Agra, he's just amazed. He says, when he sees the emperor, he says that he was clothed or rather laden with diamonds, rubies, pearls, and other precious vanities, so great, so glorious. His neck, arm, breast, above the elbows, his wrists and fingers, each had 2 or 3 rings fettered with chains of diamonds, rubies as great as walnuts, some greater, and pearls such as mine eyes were amazed at. Jewels, which is one of his felicities, this emperor is the treasury of the world. So this was part of the business of statecraft. The Mughals wanted to present themselves as the richest, the greatest emperors in the world, which indeed they were. Their only rivals were not anything in the West. Agra and Delhi were both the size of London, Madrid, Lisbon, Paris, and Rome all put together at this point. There are 5 times as many subjects of the Mughal Empire as for the Ottoman Empire. But the only rival is Ming China. And Ming China can just about equate with the Mughals at this point. But these are the 2 great powers of the 17th century. But following the Hindu-phobic policies of Shah Jahan's son Aurangzeb and the beginning of an internal conflict against Hindu and Muslim, the Mughal Empire was built very much as a joint project between the Mughals and the Rajputs. And most of the actual conquests of the Mughals were the business of the Rajput armies, led by the Rajputs from Rajasthan, conquering often Muslim states in the south for the Mughals. But that alliance breaks down under Aurangzeb, the thing begins to shatter, and by 1739, next slide, this is Muhammad Shah Rangila, who is the emperor at the time of the collapse of the empire. Now, Muhammad Shah Rangila is, as you can see here, a very colorful character, as his name Rangila would suggest. He likes playing holy. He's very keen on his courtesans. Next slide, he has his portrait painted a number of times. Once even, next slide, he's shown making love, which is something never been seen before in imperial portraits, possibly because there was a rumor that he was impotent, and they sort of put this out as propaganda. Next slide. He has to face this rather surly and unpleasant-looking chap, Nadir Shah. Now, Muhammad Shah Rangila is enormously cultured. He's a poet in 4 languages. He is one of the great musicians of history. It's he who introduces the sitar and the tabla to court music. Previously, it had been a folk instrument in the Punjab, despite the fact that sort of sitars accompany every modern Bollywood film about ancient India. It's actually in the mid-18th century that the sitar first makes its appearance as a court instrument under Muhammad Shah Rangila. But his bad luck is to be a ruler at the time of this guy, Nadir Shah. Now, Nadir Shah is as different from Muhammad Shah Rangila as can be imagined. A Puritan, a militarist. Nadir Shah was the son of a humble shepherd from Khorasan who rose in the Persian army through his military ability, eventually overthrew the Safavid dynasty, and 2 years after coming to power, he then invades Afghanistan. And at this point, the Mughals rule from Kabul to the Carnatic still in the 1730s, all the way from Afghanistan to southern India. And when he finds that he can take Kabul with no resistance, he realizes that the Mughal war machine isn't what it once was, and he carries on. He takes Lahore, still no resistance, so he heads for Delhi. And in 1739, at the Battle of Karnal, one of the most important battles in Indian history, Nadir Shah, with 150,000 mounted musketeers, defeats 3 Mughal armies merged together, 1.5 million men. And he does this because his musketeers are armed with the latest in 18th century military technology, which is an armor-piercing swivel gun, which you mount on the neck of a horse. And Nadir Shah lures the Mughal army into a great heroic charge, and they come cantering across the plains of Karnal. And at the very last minute, his light cavalry part, like a curtain on a stage, to reveal the long line of stationary mounted swivel guns. And in the next 10 minutes, the flower of Mughal, it's like the Somme, the flower of Mughal chivalry lie dead on the ground in one of the most crushing defeats in history. And he then invites Muhammad Shah Rangilia to dinner. The silly fool accepts and is not allowed to leave the Persian camp. Then together they ride into Delhi and they literally hoover up all the precious gems, jewelry, gold and silver that the Mughals have spent 8 generations looting. All the different tiers of the treasuries under the Red Fort are emptied and loaded onto no less than, I think it's 3,000 camels. Here we are. 700 elephants, 4,000 camels, 12,000 horses carrying wagons laden with gold. So this enormous caravan of loot heads off from Delhi up back to Persia. Some falls into the swollen rivers of the monsoon Chenab. Some clumper down the hillsides of the Hindu Kush. But most of this loot is lost to South Asia forever. And according to this one source, in the first mention that we have of this diamond in actual history, among the things looted on the top of the peacock throne is this, next slide, is this Kohinoor. And Nadir Shah, like the Mughal emperors before him, has a problem. He's got all these gems and doesn't know what to do with them. So as well as the peacock throne, he decides to make the most glittery tent in the world. He has the Mughal artisans build the jeweled tent. And onto this tent are sewn these tens of thousands of gems and rubies and diamonds, which are not part of the peacock throne. And this extraordinary assemblage travels all the way up to Central Asia, where in Herat, in Western Afghanistan, all this loot is put on display. According to the memoirs of Kashmiri soldier Abdul Karim, on arrival, the treasures were put on display, and the tent was ordered to be pitched in the Diwan Khana. Publication was made by beat of drum throughout the city and camp that all persons had liberty to come to this magnificent exhibition, such as never been seen in any age or country. In beauty and magnificence, the tent was beyond all description. The outside of the tent was covered in fine scarlet brocade. The lining was of violet covered by satin, on which were representations of all the birds of creation, trees and flowers made of pearls, diamonds, and rubies. On both sides of the peacock throne, there was a screen on which were placed 2 angels made of precious stones. So you get the impression, this incredible glitter sitting there. But Nadir Shah, who has risen from nothing, who has conquered the Mughal Empire, becomes this sort of crazed figure. Quite early on after conquering India, he becomes convinced that his eldest son is plotting to assassinate him, and he has his eldest son blinded. And from that point begins to descend into madness and begins to heap up mountains of corpses wherever he goes. And eventually, in 1747, his own family do plot a real assassination attempt, and his closest associates join in this plan. And on the night of the 20th of June, 1747, Nadir Shah is killed by his own family and bodyguard in his tent. And there then breaks out one of the most sort of bloody nights in history. And we have very good descriptions of it because he has a Jesuit physician who is present in the camp. And there's basically two camps within the camp, if you like, two factions. One are the Persians, and one are the Afghans. And the Afghans protect the harem or guard the harem during the night, and are, according to Afghan sources, given the Kohinoor by Nadir's widow as a reward for protecting them. The Jesuit source puts it slightly differently, that the Persians land in the harem and run off with this thing. Whatever happens, the Afghans set off by dawn in the direction of Kandahar. On the way out, they capture an enormous caravan of booty which is coming into the camp. They turn it around and take it off to Kandahar with them. And with that booty, the leader of the Afghan bodyguards, who's a man called Ahmed Shah Abdali, founds a new country called Afghanistan. And Ahmed Shah Abdali is the founder of Afghanistan, and he does it with the Kohinoor now detached from the peacock throne on his arm, and with this loot that he's captured on the night of Nadir Shah's assassination as his treasure chest. And Ahmed Shah Abdali makes the first great Afghan empire, which encompasses not just Afghanistan, but modern Pakistan, quite a lot of modern Iran, Kashmir, and a lot of northern India. And the stone, at this point, goes off from Persian hands into Afghan hands. The peacock throne, incidentally, is pulled apart the night of Nadir's assassination. You can imagine the scene of sort of bloodshed as these tribesmen. And James Bailey Fraser, the Scottish traveller, 20 years later interviews a Kurdish chieftain who saw the throne being pulled apart. And he says how they disdained even to fill their pockets with pearls. Because they were valueless compared to the diamonds and the rubies as they pulled this thing apart. So this scene of incredible bloodshed with diamonds being thrown around, the peacock throne being hacked to bits. But the Kohinoor has gone off with the Afghan faction. And Ahmed Shah Abdali passes the Kohinoor on to his son, Timur Shah. Timur Shah is this little dwarf figure who has to have a jeweled footstool to get onto his horse. He also wears the Kohinoor on his arm. He hands it on to his eldest son called Zahir Shah. Shah Zaman. And Shah Zaman, as so often in South Asia, dynasties produce less and less impressive people each successive generation. Now, I can't think of any modern dynasty which each successive generation has produced progressively more pathetic politicians. But certainly this is the case with Ahmed Shah Abdali. And Timur Shah loses half the empire. Shah Zaman loses the rest of it. And at one point, he is captured by his enemies in the Shinwari tribe, who blind him with a red-hot diamond. Blind him with a red-hot poker. And before he's blinded, Shah Zaman has secreted the Kohinoor in a crack in his prison cell in this fort. So when eventually his brother, this isn't a dwarf from The Hobbit, like it looks, or something from Lord of the Rings. This is Shah Shuja-ul-Mulk, who is the younger brother of Shah Zaman. When he, 5 years later, regains power for the Abdali dynasty, the Durrani dynasty, he sends out search parties to try and find the two big stones, because as well as the Kohinoor, there's also the great Timur ruby. And the Kohinoor from this period is always referred to as part of this dualism. On one arm they wear the Kohinoor, which is a white diamond, and on the other side the great Timur ruby, which is a big red stone. So he sends out search parties, and they strike lucky. They find the Kohinoor has been taken out of this crack in the prison cell, and a mullah in a nearby village who doesn't know what it is using it as a paperweight for his sermon. And meanwhile, the Timur ruby, which was hidden under a stone in the river before he was arrested, has been found by a student, and that's taken away too. So Shah Shuja gets these two stones back. And it's under him that we get the first description of the Kohinoor from a Western source. And in 1791, just give me 1 second. It's 1803. In 1803, Shah Shuja receives an embassy from the East India Company, who in the intervening 30 or 40 years have moved from being a power in Bengal and Madras to conquer all of northern India. And they already, by 1803, have got an overlordship over Delhi. And they come up from Delhi bearing gifts, and the leading diplomat of the embassy, Mount Stuart Elphinstone, describes for the first time in English this diamond, the Kohinoor, which he says already is a celebrated diamond. So the first reference we've got is 1750. 50 years later, this has now become a celebrated gem. Partly, one imagines, because it's been detached from the peacock throne, where it was one among a huge number of other incredibly gorgeous stones, and actually worn on the arm. And so people have begun to focus on it. Mount Stuart Elphinstone says, the King of Kabul was a handsome man of olive complexion with a thick, dark beard. His expression was dignified and pleasing. He wore large flowers of gold and precious stones on his clothes, a breastplate of diamonds shaped like two flattened fleurs-de-lis, ornaments of the same kind of each side of his thighs, 2 large bracelets on his arms, and many other jewels in place. In one of these bracelets was the Kohinoor, first mentioned in English, 1803. So shortly after Shah Shuja is visited by the East India Company, he loses power in the way that his brother did before him. And he's captured by his enemies, put in prison by the governor of Kashmir. But his very powerful and strong-willed wife, Wuffa Begum, makes it to Lahore, where a new power is rising. And this power, next slide, please. Next one after that, is Ranjin Singh. Now, Ranjin Singh starts off as a humble chieftain outside Lahore, and he builds the Sikh empire out of the collapse of the Afghan empire. Initially, a vassal of Shah Zaman, the guy who was blinded, he seizes more and more of the lands that the Afghans have occupied and builds this Sikh empire out of it in one generation. And Wuffa Begum flees to him and reaches a deal with Ranjin Singh and says to Ranjin Singh, if you can spring my husband from his prison in Kashmir, you can have his most valuable possession, the Kohinoor. And this is exactly what happens. Ranjin Singh mounts an expedition to Kashmir, which is at that point in civil war. Everyone's fighting with each other. They capture the castle where Shah Shuja is being kept. They release him and then take him to Lahore. And Shah Shuja has not given any assent to this plan. It's his wife that has promised him this. So obviously he's a bit upset because it's the last thing he has. He's lost his empire. All he's got left is this diamond, hidden somewhere. No one knows where he's hidden it. And so Ranjin Singh has to start using pressure. And there are, as often with the history of the Kohinoor, varying accounts of this pressure. The Sikh accounts say merely that Shah Shuja handed it over in thanks for hospitality. But Shah Shuja's account is that Ranjin Singh tortures his young son in front of him. And and we have many accounts that he's placed apart from his women under house arrest and eventually put in a cage. And only when he hands over the diamond is he given his free. Is he allowed out of the cage? He then has to escape, and Shah Shuja escapes from Lahore eventually through the sewage system and makes it over to British India. So Ranjin Singh is the first person to make a real song and dance about the Kohinoor. And it's under Ranjin Singh that the Kohinoor begins to rise into everyday visibility. So Ranjin Singh famously likes his liquor, a good Sadaji that he is. In the absence of bagpiper whiskey or any of these modern Punjabi whiskies, he drinks his own potent blend of opium musk and raw alcohol. And on one occasion in his youth, when he got completely out of his head on this stuff, his jewels were stolen from him in his own bedroom. And he's terrified this will happen again with the Kohinoor. So he develops an incredibly elaborate security system. Wherever he goes, 40 camels follow him with identical panniers. And in one of these is the Kohinoor, and only the jeweler knows it's actually always in the second camel. But no one else is meant to know this. And so there's a whole, and he has this state treasury called Gobingar outside Amritsar. Gobingar is still there today, is where the Kohinoor is kept when it's not on his arm. And as the British begin to cast their eyes onto Afghanistan and begin to make an alliance with Ranjit Singh in the late 1830s, the Kohinoor appears in more and more British travellers' accounts. And Ranjit Singh is a very ordinary-looking guy with one wall eye, pockmarked, makes a great point of surrounding himself by some of the most handsome men in India. These incredibly beautiful Punjabi men are his courtiers. And he dresses very simply in white pajamas, but with the Kohinoor on his arm. The Kohinoor becomes a constant feature of British travel accounts. And as Ranjit Singh is dying in 1839, an unseemly squabble breaks out between his courtiers because Ranjit Singh wants the diamond to go to the Jagannath temple in Orissa. And he's giving away all his things to temples in his last few hours. But he's had a stroke and he can't communicate. And his treasurer, who wants his son Karak Singh and the dynasty to continue having this stone, hides it. And Ranjit Singh is gesticulating soundlessly from his deathbed, and everyone's pretending not to understand what he means. So there's this very sort of tragic death scene with the Kohinoor being argued over. And in the few years that follow Ranjit Singh's death, the Punjab, which has been created into this marvelous empire, incredibly well run, with a brilliant army overseen by ex-Napoleonic generals, over the next few years, the Punjab descends into anarchy. And 3 successive successors of Ranjit Singh are assassinated or killed or slow poisoned with slow-acting toxins in order to get the Kohinoor out of them. And eventually, at the end of the Second Sikh War in 1849, the British march in and they take the thing in the famous scene with Dalhousie. Next slide. Next, please. That's Ranjit Singh. Here he is, and you can see the stone on his arm in this if it had better blackout. Next slide. So 1849, the Brits finally get their hands on this diamond. Wherever this diamond has gone, bloodshed, blindings, torture have followed it. But the story does not the bad luck does not cease once it gets into British hands. The first thing that happens is that Dalhousie, who's a rather peppery Scotsman, about a month after this handover, the couriers come to take it to Bombay to be carried by sea in great secrecy to London. And Dalhousie has this terrible turn. He's thinking, where is it? And he can't remember where he's put the bloody diamond. After having sort of gone to this great song and dance and giving it to the Queen, announcing it, he has lost it. And so he tries to think what he was wearing, as one does, what you were wearing the day you last saw it. And he remembers he's wearing a particular tweed suit. So he asks his equerry, this old Siddharji, where the tweed suit. And he said, I hung it up in your cupboard. And he, in fact, checks the pocket, nothing. And he said, was there anything in it? And the Siddharji looks blank and says, there was a box containing an old bit of glass that I put in your cupboard, sir. So he gets this thing back, and he gives it to the couriers, and eventually it's shipped to Bombay and put on the ship Medea, bound for London. And I don't know if you know that Werner Herzog film, Aguirre, Wrath of God, when Klaus Kinski as Dracula is heading towards Amsterdam. Plague breaks out on the ship. This happens on the Medea. Cholera breaks out, and everyone begins to die. But they've only got as far as Mauritius when they try and land because half the sailors have killed. They can't do the rigging anymore, and the Mauritians shell the ship. They won't allow it to land because it's so ridden with cholera. And somehow this ship makes it back with 2 living sailors and parks outside Portsmouth. And it's only at this point that the Queen, next slide, finally gets her hands on it. And it goes briefly through the hands of the Queen straight into the Great Exhibition. And at the Great Exhibition, the Kohinoor is the center of attraction. And there's been a great deal of press about this stone in the run-up to the Great Exhibition. And Mr. Chubb, who starts Chubb Locks, which is still a company in existence, builds a special glass safe for it, which has a mechanism which, if anyone tries to tamper with it in any way, the diamond is sort of secreted into a sort of special mechanism which brings it down out of sight into the bowels of the lock and locks it beyond reach of anyone that doesn't have all the appropriate keys and master locks. But it's a huge disappointment because there's now a great difference in taste between Europe and India in gemstones. In India, size is what matters. The Indian method is like in medieval Europe. They prefer cabochons, uncut stones, which are however weirdly shaped, are placed uncut on display in gold. But the Mughal way but the Western way has been since the end of the 18th century to have a brilliant cut and to have these symmetrical cuts which bring out the fire within the diamond. And the brilliant cut is probably originally an Indian invention, but travels very quickly to Venice and Amsterdam. By the end of the 18th century, there's a big Jewish community in Amsterdam trading diamonds, particularly with other Jewish traders in Goa. And Amsterdam and Goa is an early access of the diamond trade, and it's there that the brilliant cut begins. And by the late 19th century, you have De Beers and diamonds becoming something that every middle-class couple gives each other on an engagement. So it's only at this point that diamonds begin to rise in price, and the Kohinoor, more than ever, the Great Exhibition, rise in diamond prices, all the publicity attending the Great Exhibition, that the Kohinoor becomes the singular biggest diamond in the world. But despite the mile-long queues, there's great disappointment because it doesn't glitter. It isn't cut. And they try various mechanisms of shining different lights at different angles and different sort of holders to catch the light in different ways, but it doesn't work. And Prince Albert takes the decision that it should be recut. Next slide. And here's another show of the Great Exhibition next. Here's Dalrymple Singh, as a beautiful young man, comes to Sandringham and is shown the Kohinoor by the Queen, and then, to the Queen's relief, gives it back to her, because he could easily have claimed it. Next slide. Here he is, this wonderful Landseer portrait. Next slide. Queen Victoria, looking a bit miserable. Next slide. Dalrymple Singh again. Next slide. This is the scene. And so, having had this great hoo-ha about the Kohinoor in the Great Exhibition, and having had this huge wave of disappointment, and Punch and the Times write editorials about how disappointing this gemstone is, they decide to recut it. And rather like a sort of modern celebrity game show, they decide to get a celebrity to begin the cut. And the Duke of Wellington is pulled out of retirement, now in his 70s, and is made to do the beginning of the recut at Garrard's. And promptly thereafter has a stroke. The Kohinoor continues to haunt anyone and dies shortly afterwards. But the cut is botched. And diamonds are carbon, like coal. And if you cut them against the grain, they will incinerate and burn into thin air, like a piece of coal. And it's unclear how because they got the best diamond cutters of the day, but I think the Kohinoor must have had a particularly complex gemological structure, because they make such a hash of it in the recutting that they lose 3/4 of the weight. And what I think none of the Indians who claim the diamond back today realize is it is no longer, it was never the biggest diamond in the world. Today, it is the 151st biggest diamond in the world. It's a fraction of its former size, following this botched recut. And there are many, many other bigger diamonds. The two biggest diamonds remain the other two big diamonds. Now, the Orlov is the one that everyone forgets particularly. The Orlov was probably the stone that the French jeweler Tavernier saw when he went to see the Mughal treasury, and he called it the Great Mughal Diamond. It was probably taken by Nadir. With so much of diamond history, it's all probablys and maybes and possiblys ifs. But it was probably it was almost certainly part of the loot that Nadir Shah took away from him, and obviously fell into the hands of some Persian soldier the night Nadir Shah died, because it appears on the market in Persia, is bought by an Armenian merchant who takes it to Amsterdam. In Amsterdam, it's bought by Count Orlov, who is a lover of Catherine the Great. And anyone who was here last year will remember Potemkin and Catherine the Great of Sebag's wonderful lecture last year. Now, Count Orlov buys this. He's the lover of Catherine the Great. He goes back to Moscow, and he remains incognito until Catherine's name day, when he appears in court holding the largest diamond in the world. Gives it to Catherine, but it's too late, because unbeknown to him, Catherine is now with Potemkin. And Orlov is out of favor, and moreover has had to pawn all his estates to buy this frigging diamond. And so in the next few days, he suddenly realizes not only has he lost his girlfriend, he's lost his entire fortune, and the family are bumped out of court, and he dies raving in a lunatic asylum in a straitjacket. So all these diamonds do not come with happy tidings and goodwill with them. The Darya-Nur, the same night that Nadir Shah was assassinated, ends up with one of Nadir Shah's grandsons, who has hot oil poured on his head by the successive Qajar dynasty until he yields up its hiding place. So all these diamonds reek streams of torture and horror behind them. But the Orlov and the Darya-Nur are still the greatest of the ancient Mughal diamonds. There are now much bigger diamonds coming out of South African and Brazilian mines. But those of the old diamonds of the world, the Orlov and the Darya-Nur remain the largest. As I say, the Kohinoor, a mere 151 on the current rankings of world diamonds. What is the future of the Kohinoor? Next slide. It went on to Princess Alexandra. Following all these deaths, the Victorians loved a good bit of sort of supernatural hocus pocus. Dalhousie, as a good sort of rationalist of the Sherlock Holmes mode, denies that there's any curse attached to this diamond, but the royal family is taking no chances, and the curse is believed only to work on men, so it goes down the female line. And it was in the throne of the Queen Mother, and presumably the next possible candidate for wearing it is none other than Camilla. And so if that doesn't finish off the British monarchy, nothing else will. We wish, I think in many ways it might be a good thing if we did give it back to India, but good luck to whoever holds it. So that's it for the Kohinoor. Thank you.